Hey everyone, how's it going? Juan Dhas here, and welcome to a lesson video. It's been a while since I've done these, but I think I'm kind of in the spot where I do want to share again and just share stuff I've learned over the past few years since I took a break. I was going kind of hard on the lesson stuff for, one lesson a week for pretty much 2-3 years and trying to find new things. But I also felt like I needed to learn a couple of things along the way, and then the record came up and my focus was elsewhere, essentially, but I'd like to be doing these again. And I thought the topic of how I multi-tracked a jazz record was an interesting one to tackle, because this can hopefully give some people out there some ways of solving certain problems, or maybe hopefully inspire somebody who feels maybe I don't have the funds to go into the studio, but I have something, or I really want to get this done by any means possible, but I don't know how. With a certain group of musicians. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a roadmap or a way forward, and just things that I've learned about the whole process as I've gone through making this record. By the way, I'm just going to be upfront with this. I do want to do more lesson content. I've got one queued up about fingerstyle guitar playing that I'm thinking about, and thinking of the points I'd like to talk about. So if you have lesson topics, as always, leave them in the comment section. If I think they're interesting, I'll tackle it, or maybe at least, give me a direction to go in. I'd love to, share a little bit of what I've been working on, and maybe new developments that are present in my ever-evolving trajectory and career as a musician. So let's address the elephant in the room. Why multi-track a jazz record? Jazz, usually you record it in the room. I prefer to record it in the room. Nowadays, I wouldn't say I prefer it. I think it's just a different approach. You can do great things with a multi-track recording or in the room. They're two different approaches. But traditionally, that's how it's always been done. We've always just got together in the room. You feel supported in the moment, and that truly captures essentially the essence or spirit of jazz, which is improvising and a collective discussion or dialogue with your musicians, which is a very special component. It's a very special thing, and that can never be replaced. But, necessity is the mother of invention. And I wouldn't despite a phrase like that, I don't think I've invented anything. There have been many people who've tried this before. Scott Henderson does this with his solo albums. Maybe, I think he even did it with Tribal Tech. I'm not 100% sure on that. You'd have to ask Scott. But many people have tried this in some capacity or the other and come out with wonderful results. So this should be possible. And that was kind of the mode of thinking I was following when I tried to do this. And because the concept for the album, or when I really started to say, okay, we're going to do a record, let's go, we were still kind of in the middle of a pandemic, and I needed to find a creative way to record the music with the vision I had in mind, which was now something much larger than just a small combo, which was a sound I'd already done, and I wanted to, experiment and try something new and push myself as a composer. But I also wanted to be able to do this with the musicians I wanted, who had the sounds I was looking for, and to do this at a cost-effective budget. So the solution to this was multi-tracking a jazz record. Now, what are the pros and cons? Well, when I was doing the budget for the record, one is it's cost effective. I initially thought, okay, I'll travel to Spain and then fly all the musicians out there, or I'll do it in New York and fly myself to New York and use most of the musicians who are in New York. And I thought, how best am I going to do this? And no matter what I came up with, it was just some ridiculous sum of money, especially when you're factoring in flights, accommodation, visa costs if people need it, camera crews, additional musicians if we're doing this totally acoustic. It's a gargantuan sum of money that I didn't have at that point in time, but I had a fair amount of money saved, enough to do a record, even here in Colombia. So I thought to myself, okay, I really want to do it with these musicians this go around. How can we go about this? So multi-tracking was the best way forward. The other thing is it allowed more control over the sound. You know, everyone has their own sound. They're kind of dialed in their recording. They're in a comfortable space. You know, there's less pressure in a way. There's less of a time constraint. You're not paying for studio time, which is expensive and gets more expensive every year pretty much. So everyone has the leisure of tracking at their own, they can track at their own leisure, really. By the way, yes, forgive any miscommunications. I improvise all of these videos and all of my lessons, so you're getting an off-the-cuff, really in-the-room feel, as it were. The other thing was it would allow me to experiment with some musicians, and most of the budget didn't have to go towards actually tracking in a studio. Assuming everyone has their own equipment and has their own cameras, or lighting, or even at minimum a phone, you can create your own marketing plan with videos and you can do your own music. So I heavily invested in the musicianship, let's put it that way, as opposed to extraneous things. Now, does that limit what you can do? Yes, but if you have a limited budget, you do with it what you can. So with all of this said and done, we've decided, okay, we're doing an album, we're multi-tracking it. How do we go about it? How do we even conceptualize it? How do you even preserve interaction? I think this is a good thing to touch on because let's think of it this way. What is interaction? It's essentially response to a stimulus. Now, at its simplest. Now, with interaction, when you're trying to capture that in a setting, yes, the purest interaction you're going to get is if you're recording in the room with somebody, you're in the same space. But, you know, interaction I don't think is as ubiquitous as it may seem. Even though you're constantly reacting, it's not something that's very overt. And I've been gearing myself more towards picking my spots more carefully as opposed to just reacting to every single little piece of information, which I think can actually affect a composition or a tune. So now understanding that interaction will only be its purest when you're recording in the room, you're walking in understanding, okay, we are sacrificing something. I'm not going to pretend that you're going to achieve something impossible, unless, you know, video calling software or some of the software that is out there, like there was one software that allowed you to record and do video calls at zero latency, pretty much, or the absolute smallest latency possible. I can't remember it. But until that progresses, you're not going to be able to get interaction over a distance just yet. At least to my knowledge. Maybe the technology is already out there, but it wasn't there for when we were doing the record, as it were. So how do we preserve that? And I think to do this, the way we managed it was we had to abide by a certain set of criteria. So one of those is preserve as many full-length takes as possible. So that means minimal editing. 2, as minimal listening to the source material as possible. You get the best reactions, or the closest thing to a natural reaction, when you haven't heard the stimulus over and over again. And provided that there's material to work with, which I'll touch on in a little bit, provided there's material to work with, you can react to something, and you can kind of mimic it, or get some interactions that are genuine. Just, you know, try to avoid hearing the same thing over and over again, because then you'll start to plan things, and that's what we want to avoid. The third thing we tried to do was track as little as possible to a click. Yes, sometimes it was inevitable. For tunes like Memoria, we needed a click because we realized the tempo was starting to dip, or it just wouldn't have the push we wanted. So that one we needed a metronome to track percussion to. I think there was another one that needed a click just to kind of wrap things up pretty nicely, and really make sure everyone was connected. But most of the tunes were actually tracked without a click. Socotra, Elpis, Communion didn't have a click because programming that would be way too annoying because of all the meter changes. Also, just hearing that would be kind of annoying. But there would be a couple little things that I'll maybe get into of how we managed to do it. And I also told people, pick your spots carefully. Pick your spots, like I want you to imagine that there's a version of you sitting across, this was something I got from Daniele Camarda. There's a version of you sitting on the other side of the room listening to you play. And I want you to play exactly what is supposed to be played in that moment, or really think about what you're going to play and where you're going to place it. I think having all of those parameters helped get a better performance out of each musician, as well as the technological side of things. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of how do you do this? So we've got a bit of why we did this, the philosophy, at least I wanted most of the performers, whether this was actually said in conversation or kind of unspoken. Some of them just naturally think this way, so it makes communicating a lot easier. But how do we get this to happen? So the first step was actually all started with me. It all started with me in my living room, pretty much, and creating demos, or as high quality demos as possible for the musicians to play to. Now, why is this? Because if I had just given them a basic rendering of just, okay, here's the melody, here's the solo section, here's the outro, it would have been pretty uninspiring to play to, especially if it was just MIDI information. And because I'm playing around with strings and choirs and voices and other parts, you know, it kind of behooves you to give them the best possible result so they can track to. So one, they can track to it, and two, you get the best possible performance out of your musicians. So that means, you know, initially I did that using percussion tracks. So I'd track a percussion section with Klevgran's plugins. So I'd use Borsta and Skaka, which are two of their wonderful plugins. I use them for everything. You've likely already heard them a million times on my channel. I think I did the Mockups with Spitfire's Appassionata strings, and then eventually I upgraded it to chamber strings and actually tweaked the performances and, you know, the arrangements in and of themselves. I'll touch on the string writing further on in the video because there's some interesting stuff there. And then I would, you know, do a MIDI bass thing, actually play in a bass part with my MIDI keyboard, just actually playing it in myself. And then I would actually record scratch solos and melodies so that the musicians had something to react to and everything was all on a grid. Now, the other thing to touch on in this phase, and this is the second thing to keep in mind, plan everything. Now, this kind of flies in the face of a jazz record, but if you think about it, the old records back in the day of, you know, the old Charlie Parker records were just, okay, we play the head in, maybe once or twice, head in once or head in twice, 2 chorus solo you, 2 chorus solo for you, let's trade 4s or trade 8s, head out, done. And you would have a very clear recording. Those are beautiful recordings for what they are. Now, this is not to disparage another way of thinking, and I've done records where, you know, the solo is a 3 or 4 minute solo, or I'm letting the soloist, be it myself or my drummer or my bassist or whomever, explore everything they need to, and that creates a dialogue in and of itself, and that is another aesthetic. But I find as I've got older, or as I've gained more experience, I am appreciating brevity and being extremely concise with what you want to say. I'm appreciating that a lot more. And so for this to work, if you're multi-tracking a jazz record, that means planning how long are your intros? How many times through the head do you want to, how many times do you want to play through the head? Once, twice? Does the tune benefit from that? 1 chorus or 2 choruses? So, how long is your outro? How would I establish this? I would actually sing over the parts. So sometimes I'd take a solo and actually either physically play a solo or even sing a solo, especially for drummers or bass solos. I would kind of do the equivalent, and if it were a vamp, I'd decide, okay, this is long enough. I'd say, okay, let's try 2 choruses. And if it was a long form tune, let's say if it were a long form tune, maybe it would be too long. So I would say, okay, 1 chorus, it feels short, but I would prefer it to be shorter than have this be far too long, especially so you can interact and, grow something over the course of the music, as opposed to kind of let things sit for too long. Those would be or let's say for drum solos, I would actually sing over the vamp, kind of mimic out a drum solo, and then I would cut it to that length and listen back to it. But I would also ask the musicians, hey, do you want something longer, shorter, before I sent them the final tracks, just to, actually take that into account when we were doing things. Okay, so let's say we've got our mock-up. The strings are there, the parts are there, everything's done, everything's sounding really nice. I've done this a brief mix. It's comfortable-ish to listen to. I'm ready to send it out to musicians. So I would always start with drums or percussion for obvious reasons. And they would react to things I had played. So they would react to my solo over the changes and playing the tune. Hold that thought. And I'm back. So I did have to change the camera battery on the camera. I did say this was going to be a long video. So when we're talking about drums and sending this out, this was probably one of the few stages where I said, okay, maybe using a click is advisable. Because especially if you want to hear where the general subdivision is, for some of the tunes, it's not immediately obvious according to the melody. Or sometimes you want that push. Now, some people might say, oh, a click isn't really used in jazz, and you would be right for the most part, but when, I think I remember this Antonio Sanchez interview, he was talking about recording with Michael Brecker, and it was with strings. And he said, just send, the session was a disaster. This applies more if you have actual string players in the room. Because you have to coordinate between multiple groups and people, you're in the room, but you're also not in the room. So everyone has to kind of follow each other. That I think it was, he told Michael, send the click to myself and the bassist, and everyone else can, attach themselves to us and, group around us. And initially Michael was worried about the whole interaction thing, but it ended up working out exactly as they'd wanted. A similar thing to think about is, I remember checking out a Wynton Marsalis masterclass and them talking about all the edits they do when they actually make a record. So I figured, okay, there are all these things we should probably be taking advantage of. It's a nice aesthetic, and we can do records the way they were done in the 60s and the 70s, or the 60s and before, with minimal mic setups, go in, play the tunes in one day, and we're done. But we have all of this at our disposal, that we should take advantage of it. And already I'm kind of throwing the quote-unquote jazz rulebook out the window, so I might as well lean into it. But most of the tunes were done without a click. It was only for, I think, Unsung Hymn, I had a click on 2 and 4 for Antonio to track to, just so there's a rhythmic pulse. Memoria had a click for Patrick to get the drive we wanted, because otherwise it would dip quite naturally. And I don't know if Jade had a click. I don't think so. But all the other tunes were actually done without a click, funnily enough. But it worked because they were all on the grid and I did the mock-up. So then after percussion and drums were tracked and we'd figured out sounds for each person and the recording rig, or the general aesthetic direction that we wanted to go in for the album, rhythmically speaking, I would then send this to Anthony Anthony would track bass. Sometimes I'd be sitting on a Zoom call with him and he would be tracking. And then I would get that take back, and then I would retrack everything. Now, bear in mind, I would have a fresh experience, so to speak, because I hadn't played to the tunes in a while. I hadn't listened to them exactly, and I didn't know what the guys were sending me until I pretty much got it and stuck it into the session. So I would react accordingly. And to preserve kind of the mindset for each tune, I would do one tune a day, pretty much. So everything was kind of done in a week or two. But one tune a day and focus on getting all of the parts out of the way. All the melodies, what was it? Melodies, any comping parts I needed to. I already told the story of Scarlet Thread a while ago. So I would think about all of this by the time it came around to me. And at this point, it's sounding like a full production. I'm reacting to things as if I were hearing them kind of through headphones and if I were in a booth. It's not that different. The main difference, and this is the thing that you get with tracking all together, is that even if you're in a booth, there's kind of this unconscious, what's the term I'm looking for? This unconscious comfort, right? This unconscious comfort of knowing that the musicians are playing with you. That's the main difference. But otherwise, if you think of it very abstractly as reacting to a stimulus, you can get similar results. Okay, so we've talked about the mock-ups, we've talked about drums, bass. Bass was actually interchangeable for some of the tunes, because after drums we had Santiago track, because there was already enough information that was workable and that he could react to. Then I would send to Anthony, then I did my stuff, and then I did the vocals on top. And that was kind of the process of recording the whole thing. Now, what about tech specs? Like, okay, this is all wonderful, but I don't have all the gear. Well, for me, I mean, I'm recording this with a lapel mic going, like a really cheap lapel mic, going into my audio interface, which is a Zoom recorder. And then from the Zoom recorder, I would have a 57 that's sitting in front of my amp, going into my Zoom, and I would have the little gooseneck mic that I did going into the Zoom, and I had an extra mic just in case, going to the direct out that is in the back of my quilter. Now, let's say you don't have a quilter, Neural DSP sounds pretty great these days. I mean, there are people doing wonderful things. Amp modelers have come a long way. You can use a fractal, you can use a helix, you can use a quad cortex. I just like the immediacy of an amp and the dynamic response I get from it. But, you know, you could get that on discount and you could begin recording your guitar tones. The drummers all had their own mic setups. I think Kika had 2 overheads, 2 tom mics, snare, and kick, I think, if I remember correctly. Patrick multi-tracked things, but that allowed him to get really lush percussion textures, and he would do full takes of each thing, of each element. Anthony did a blend of DI and the cab. Antonio Fusco was a 4 mic setup, and Santiago just tracked straight into the box with his synths. So you can make this work as far as tech goes, and you know, a 57, a Zoom recorder, and let's say I'm using the gooseneck mic, but that's $50. You know, one thing at a time, slowly build your mic setup over time, and you can give yourself the tools to record. Now let's talk about strings. Strings, there's some interesting stuff for anyone who's curious about the world of MIDI and the choirs. So I used a blend of Spitfire chamber strings for the lushness and the width, but it's not quite a symphonic size. You know, I'm trying to think realistically, and, you know, a rhythm section with a 90-piece orchestra sounds a little insane, so we don't need that many string players. And there's a more intimate sound that comes with a, you know, like a 12-piece string section, or I think it was 13. So it was 4, 3, 3, and 3. And I didn't use a double bass or upright bass because I figured I already have a bass player, and it helps the agility of how the section can interact with the music. So I'd write the parts out and then separate them. So I have violin 1, violin 2, viola cello. And then what helps the realism, if it were, is CC1 and CC11. There are plenty of videos talking about that online, but this helps you get your curves right for when they should ebb into a note, when they should let a note decay, and experimenting with different articulations. And then I layered this with Orchestral Tools Berlin first chairs for more detail in the sound, and that gets you a slightly more realistic result. Obviously, you can do this with any combination of libraries. Choose what you will and what you have available to you. I got these libraries all at a discount when they were on sale. And for the choirs, the same thing, CC1, CC11 to help the realism. And that was the Tallinn choir from, I think it was specifically the Tallinn female choir from Orchestral Tools. And sometimes I would suspend belief because I'm like, well, I'm already doing this record in an odd way. I may as well just lean into it. And sometimes the choirs were kind of 50-50. Sometimes I would think like an actual, okay, where are they going to breathe? Where is a good spot to use the choir? And sometimes I would use them more as a texture, as a pad. So it goes both ways, you know, treating them as realistic instruments so that you get a response and that it feels like you're playing with strings and choirs. But at the same time, right, leaning into the fact that they're not real. So I can suspend belief and just create a beautiful texture. And at the end of the day, in closing, I think it's all about just, I wanted to make really nice music that I would enjoy listening to, that was fun for me to create, that pushed my creative and performance abilities and forced me to grow. But hopefully it's just that, you know, anyone can listen to this record and enjoy it, hopefully. And at the end of the day, it's just all of this is fueling how am I going to get my music out there? And at least in my mind, I wanted to do this by any means necessary. I think I'd had it percolating in my head long enough, especially since Catharsis. Catharsis was released in 2018. Some of the music was written in 2019. It's been 5 years. 5 years, and it's time for this record, and I don't want to delay it any longer, but I want to make sure it's done well. And this opened up plenty of avenues for creativity, but also opened up a potential way to make records in the future if the finances don't allow for it, if I can't get everybody in the same place. Obviously, that would be the go-to. If I can get everyone in the same room, that would be ideal. But if we can't, then we can still make some really lovely music regardless. So I hope this gives a roadmap to some people out there. I know it's a bit of a long video. It's coming up at like 30 minutes at this point. But this way you eliminate any excuses if you can, you know, save and get the gear you can bit by bit. Maybe you already have some of the gear around you and you don't even know it. Contact the musicians you would like, and this really doesn't put a barrier in front of you. You know, I was talking to a bunch of musicians and all of them, you know, agreed it was just a question of budgeting. But at the end of the day, if they love the music, you can get whichever musician you want, maybe even some of your favorite musicians or your closest friends, even if they live on the other side of the world, and you can still get a wonderful result out of it. So go check out the record if you haven't already, and if this has inspired you to maybe try putting a record of your own together, then I couldn't be happier, and I wish you all the best. So take care, and I will see you in another lesson video in the future. Until next time.